Miami welcomed another morning with the scattering of sunlight on the glass facades of skyscrapers and the usual noise of the waking city. Juliet Van Holden, as usual, woke up 15 minutes before the alarm clock rang. It had become her peculiarity over the past 10 years to wake up before the set time, as if her internal chronometer was set a little more accurately than the electronic one. She reached for the bedside table, where there was a glass of water left over from the evening. 3 sips. Another habit developed over the years. The large penthouse bedroom was slowly filling up with morning light streaming in through the automatically sliding blinds. Juliet loved these first few minutes of the day, when she could enjoy the silence before plunging into the maelstrom of business meetings and decisions. At 42, she had achieved what she had dreamed of in her youth. Her own chain of designer clothing boutiques, Van Holden Elite, was successfully growing, bringing in a steady income. 4 stores in the most prestigious shopping centers of Miami, contracts with the leading fashion houses of Europe, a staff of professional sales consultants. All this was the result of 15 years of hard work. Juliet walked into the spacious dressing room, where each item had its own place. Today she had an important meeting with suppliers from Milan, and her choice of outfit was of particular importance. She settled on a dark blue Armani suit and a white silk blouse and carefully placed the clothes on the couch next to the large mirror. After a half-hour treatment in the bathroom, where all the supplies were arranged in perfect order, Juliet began her makeup routine. Her movements had been honed by years of practice. A light tone, subtle blush, lipstick in a muted shade of red. She examined her reflection critically. Time had spared her so far, but for the past 6 months, she'd been noticing more and more signs of fatigue under her eyes. Breakfast was as orderly as everything else in her life. The coffee machine had already made an Americano, the toaster heated the whole grain bread, and the vase held fresh fruit delivered the day before. Reviewing her morning mail on her tablet, Juliet was automatically ticking off the day's tasks when her eyes caught the letter from her doctor. Her annual checkup indicated that she needed to move more. Her sedentary lifestyle was beginning to take its toll on her health. Sighing, she opened her browser and typed in the query, "Best fitness clubs in Miami." Among the first results was Elite Fitness, a state-of-the-art fitness facility located just 2 blocks from her office. With little thought, Juliet dialed the number. "Elite Fitness, good morning," came a pleasant female voice. "What can I do for you?" "Good morning, I'm interested in a personal trainer." "Sure, I can get you in for a consultation. My name is Acacia. I'm the club administrator. When would it be convenient for you to come over?" After a brief discussion, Juliet made an appointment for 6 o'clock in the evening. This minor step suddenly excited her. The last time she'd exercised had been in college, except for the occasional walk along the promenade. The day passed in the usual rhythm of meetings and phone calls. Negotiations with the Milanese suppliers had been successful. The new collection was to appear in the boutiques just in time for the start of the season. Toward evening, Juliet found herself nervous for her upcoming visit to the gym. It was an unusual feeling for a woman used to being in control. Elite Fitness was located in a modern building with panoramic windows. The spacious lobby greeted her with dim lighting and light background music. Behind the receptionist's desk sat a young girl with unusual hair color. It was a delicate lavender shade. "Good evening, I'm Acacia. We spoke on the phone this morning." She smiled. "Please come in. I'll show you to the locker room and then I'll introduce you to the trainer." Juliet noted the professionalism of the staff. Everything was organized clearly and politely. Having changed into a new tracksuit, bought especially for this occasion, she followed Acacia to the gym. "Sterling, this is Mrs. Van Holden!" The receptionist called out to a tall young man who was adjusting one of the machines. He turned around, and Juliet was confused for a moment. Sterling Walsh was more than just attractive. He was the type of man who had always caught her eye. Dark hair styled in a casual style, well-defined cheekbones, attentive green eyes, and a smile that brought a charming dimple to his cheeks. "Nice to meet you." His voice turned out to be a pleasant baritone. "Let's start by talking about your goals and putting together a training program." The next hour flew by. Sterling turned out to be not only a professional trainer, but also a great conversationalist. He listened attentively to all Juliet's wishes, made an initial diagnosis, and suggested the optimal schedule of training, 3 times a week. "You have excellent data," he said, writing down the indicators. "I think we'll see noticeable results in a month." Juliet caught herself looking at his arms, strong, with well-defined veins that spoke of years of hard training. Sterling didn't seem to notice her gaze as he professionally explained the principles of working different muscle groups. "When do we start?" he asked, finishing his notes. "Maybe tomorrow?" Juliet was surprised at her own haste. "Great," Sterling smiled. "Then I'll see you at the same time." As she left the gym, she felt unusually excited. As she passed the receptionist's desk, Juliet noticed Acacia giving her an attentive look, but she didn't pay it any mind. After all, she was here for her health, not for an attractive trainer. Once home, however, Juliet caught herself continuing to think about Sterling's green eyes and his professional hands. She walked to the window. The lights of Miami at night reflected in the dark waters of the bay. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like checking her work email before going to bed. The 3 weeks flew by. Juliet was surprised to find herself looking forward to training with an eagerness she hadn't felt in years. Sterling proved to be an attentive trainer. He knew exactly when to add exercise and when to give her a break. Their communication gradually went beyond the usual exercise instructions. That evening, she arrived earlier than usual. Acacia was at the reception desk talking on the phone, and Juliet caught a snippet of conversation. "Ted, you know you can't change the schedule at the last minute." After changing her clothes, Juliet went out into the hall and saw Sterling talking to a tall, broad-shouldered man. His companion was gesticulating vigorously, clearly annoyed about something. "Look, Sterl, you can't do that!" It came to her before the men noticed her presence. Sterling was instantly transformed, wearing his trademark smile. "Juliet, you're early today. I'd like you to meet Ted Morrison, a colleague of mine." Ted nodded, giving her a quick scrutinizing glance that flashed something akin to disapproval. "Pleased to meet you," he said dryly, then turned to Sterling and added, "We'll talk again." Training began as usual, but Juliet felt that Sterling was a little distracted. His phone vibrated several times, and each time he cast a worried look at the screen. "Is something wrong?" she asked when he checked the messages a third time. Sterling faltered, running a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd already learned to recognize as a sign of worry. "Nothing serious, just a little trouble with the bank." "Is there anything I can do to help?" No, he shook his head, but Juliet saw a flicker of hope in his eyes for a moment. "Let's continue with the exercises." After the workout, when she was about to leave, Sterling suddenly suggested, "Why don't we have coffee? There's a great place not far away." Juliet agreed without hesitation. The cafe was small but cozy, overlooking the evening bay. They took a table by the window, and the conversation flowed easily and casually. Sterling talked about his childhood in a small town in Vermont, how he came to Miami with the dream of opening his own sports club. "Why didn't you?" Juliet asked, stirring her green tea. "Not enough money," he shrugged. "You know how it is. You take out a loan for training, then another for certification, and then you're already in debt." She nodded understandingly, remembering her first steps in business. "How much do you need to start?" "About $150,000. Sterling grinned bitterly. "But right now I'd be glad to get at least the current debts taken care of. The bank is threatening to repossess my car, and without it I can't go to my clients." Juliet felt her heart clench. She had seen promising projects crushed by financial problems many times. "How much would it take to fix the car problem?" $25,000. He shook his head. "But I can do it, really. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that." The next day, Juliet transferred $30,000 to Sterling's account marked business loan. His gratitude was sincere and touching, and for the first time in their acquaintance, he hugged her after practice. The next 2 weeks flew by like a blur. They began to meet not only in the gym, joint dinners, walks along the waterfront, once even went to the theater. Sterling was attentive and caring, able to listen and ask the right questions. Juliet felt 10 years younger. In the gym, however, something was different. She noticed the tense looks exchanged between Sterling and Tad. Acacia became colder, answered one-wordedly, and was often absent from her seat. One day, Juliet overheard a snippet of conversation in the locker room. "You can't do that," Ted's voice was muffled. "It's not fair to..." Mind your own business, Sterling said sharply. That evening, Sterling confessed that he was having trouble renting an apartment. Juliet had helped again, this time with $15,000. His gratitude was now accompanied by a kiss, gentle but confident, making her forget all her doubts. After a week, she noticed that Ted began showing up at her workouts, ostensibly working with other clients. His presence felt like a silent rebuke. One day, when Sterling stepped away to answer the phone, Ted approached her. "Be careful, Mrs. Van Holden. Not all that glitters is gold." Before she could answer, he stepped away, and Sterling returned looking unusually agitated. "I have to leave early today," he said. "It's an emergency. Shall we have dinner tomorrow?" Juliet agreed, though something in his tone made her wary. As she gathered her things in the locker room, she heard a loud argument coming from the hallway. "You can't keep this up!" Ted's voice sounded threatening. "Or else what?" Sterling's voice was defiant. "Will you tell her, or Acacia? You know how that would end?" Juliet slammed the locker shut, not wanting to hear any more. For the first time since the beginning of their relationship, she felt a prick of doubt. Maybe she had been too hasty in opening her heart and wallet to the young coach. But when Sterling met her the next day with an armful of her favorite white peonies, all doubt receded. She didn't know it would be their last night together. Monday morning began unusually for Juliet. She overslept. The electronic clock showed the beginning of 9 when she finally opened her eyes. Her head felt heavy after spending last night with Sterling. They'd stayed up late at a seaside restaurant, where he'd been unusually pensive and talked a lot about his plans for the future. Hastily packing and skipping her morning coffee ritual, she hurried to the office, where her assistant was waiting with a pile of documents that needed immediate attention. It wasn't until lunchtime that Juliet noticed that Sterling hadn't responded to her morning message. It wasn't like him. When it was time for another workout, she arrived at the gym and saw an unfamiliar girl behind the receptionist's desk. "Where's Acacia?" Juliet asked, signing the attendance register. "It's her day off today," she said. "Are you here to see Sterling?" "He didn't show up for work without telling me. I can offer you a session with another trainer." Something unpleasant tingled in her chest. Juliet took out her cell phone and dialed his number again. The long beeps ended with an answering machine. She left a message and decided to wait until tomorrow. There was no telling what might have happened. But Sterling didn't show up on Tuesday either. His phone was now completely disconnected. Juliet noticed that Ted, who usually loomed nearby, was also absent. Acacia had returned to her workstation, but she looked pale and nervous. "Do you know what's wrong with Sterling?" Juliet asked as casually as possible. Acacia shuddered and looked away. "No, he's not answering his cell phone. This has never happened before." On Wednesday morning, when Juliet was holding a meeting with the managers of her boutiques, 2 people appeared in the reception area. A 35-year-old woman in a dark suit and an older man with a graying hairline and an attentive gaze. "Mrs. Van Holden?" The man showed his ID. "Detective Lennox Reeves, this is Detective Cordelia Pierce. May we speak with you in private?" Juliet asked the managers to finish the meeting without her, and led the detectives into her office. The large panoramic windows let in a lot of light, but now it seemed darker to her. "When was the last time you saw Sterling Walsh?" Reeves asked, settling into the visitor's chair. "Sunday night." Juliet felt her throat go dry. "We had dinner at the Ocean View restaurant on the waterfront." "What time did you two break up?" Cordelia Pierce pulled out a notepad and began taking notes. "About 11. He called me a cab and said he'd walk. His apartment wasn't far." "Did he seem worried? Nervous, maybe?" Reeves watched her reaction carefully. "He was a little distracted, talking about the future, about his plans to open his own gym." "Tell me about your relationship," Pierce asked softly. Juliet hesitated. "We dated for about 2 months. It started with training at Elite Fitness." "And you were helping him financially?" Reeves had a note of steel in his voice. "Yeah, it was a business loan. He wanted to start his own business." "Total amount?" Pierce kept writing things down. "About $50,000. The detectives looked at each other. "Did you know that over the last 3 months, over $200,000 had been deposited into Mr. Walsh's account from various women?" Reeves placed a printout of the bank transactions in front of her. Juliet felt a growing unease. She saw her own transfers on the list, but they were lost among the many other amounts. Some were much larger. "Yeah, I didn't know." Her voice shook. "Have you noticed anything unusual in his behavior lately?" Pierce asked. "Maybe strange phone calls, meetings?" There were some arguments with a colleague, Ted Morrison, and then Juliet remembered Acacia's coldness. There seemed to be something going on between him and the hall administrator, Acacia Winters. Reeves made a note in his notebook. "We know about it. Miss Winters was giving him money too." Juliet felt the color of shame flood her cheeks. How could she have been so naive? "Do you have access to his apartment? Keys?" Pierce asked. "No, we weren't that close." "Where were you last night between 8 and midnight?" The question sounded like a punch. I was at home, alone, watching a soap opera and working on some paperwork." "Can anyone confirm that?" "No," Juliet suddenly realized how that sounded. "But I should have my work marks in the cloud storage. I've been looking at contracts." "We'll check," Reeves nodded. "For now, we're asking you to stay in the city. If you think of anything important, call us." He left his business card on the table. When the detectives left, Juliet sat motionless for a long time, staring at the printout of bank transactions. Outside the window, Miami lived its usual life. The sun reflected in the glass of skyscrapers, people hurried along the streets, but her world suddenly lost its colors. The phone rang, making her flinch. It was Acacia. "Mrs. Van Holden," the girl's voice trembled. "I need to talk to you. Not in the hall. It's important." "Where?" "There's a cafe on the corner of 7th and Ocean Drive." "In an hour?" Okay." Juliet packed her bag, canceled her remaining appointments, and left the office. She needed to walk around, clear her head before she talked to Acacia. Something told her it wasn't going to be an easy conversation. It was hot and humid outside, approaching one of those tropical downpours that Miami was famous for. Heavy, leaden clouds were gathering over the bay, heralding a thunderstorm. Juliet walked, trying to gather her thoughts. She replayed the last night with Sterling in her head, trying to grasp something that might explain his disappearance. Memory tucked away the details. The way he'd nervously checked his phone, the way he'd flinched at every loud sound in the restaurant, the way he'd insisted she take a cab home instead of his car as usual. Were these signs of impending trouble? Or was she just speculating in hindsight? Acacia never showed up at the cafe. Her phone was disconnected, and her messages went unread. Juliet sat at the table for over an hour, absent-mindedly stirring her long-cooled tea and watching the tropical downpour raging outside the window. At one point, she thought she was having a bad dream. In the evening, she called a cab to get to the underground parking lot of the office center where she had left her Mercedes. The elevator slowly descended to the minuscule second floor, and with each meter, the anxiety grew. When the doors opened, Juliet knew immediately. Something was wrong. In the far corner of the parking lot, the blue flashing beacons of police cars were blinking. Detective Reeves spotted her first. "Mrs. Van Holden, stay there." But she'd already seen it. Her white Mercedes was cordoned off with yellow police tape. The trunk was open, and people in blue uniform overalls labeled Crime Scene Investigation Service were scurrying around. "Jesus," was all she could say as one of the technicians stepped aside and she saw the contents of the trunk. Cordelia Pierce was quickly at her side, supporting her by the elbow. "You need to come with us to the station." All the way Juliet sat as if in a fog. A horrible picture stood before her eyes. Sterling's body, curled in an unnatural pose in the trunk of her own car. His face, usually so lively and smiling, was now stiff and pale. The police station greeted her with harsh fluorescent lights and the smell of coffee mixed with antiseptic. She was led into an interrogation room, a small room with gray walls, a table, and 3 chairs. There was a glass of water on the table, which she didn't even notice. "Tell me again where you were on Sunday and Monday night." Reeves sat across from her, his tired face seeming carved in stone. "I already told you. Tell me again." "We had dinner at the Ocean View around 9. We sat there until 11. Sterling called me a cab." "The number of the cab? The driver's name?" "Yeah, I didn't remember. It was through the Uber app." Go on. I got home around 11:30. I took a shower, checked my email, and went to bed. Your car was parked in the parking lot the whole time? Pierce intervened. Yeah, I leave it there a lot. It's hard to find a spot near the office during the day. Do you have a spare set of keys? In the office? In the safe? Who has access to it? Just me and my assistant, Martha Klein. Reeves tapped his pencil on the desk. Did you know Sterling was meeting with Acacia Winters? Juliet felt her breathing become labored. No, I did notice some tension, but they'd been in a relationship for over 6 months. Pierce put the photos in front of her. Here they are on the beach together. That was a month before you guys showed up at the gym. Sterling and Acacia looked happy in the pictures. They were hugging against the sunset, laughing about something, holding hands. She gave him money too, Pierce continued. She took out all her savings, almost $40,000. I didn't know, Juliet whispered. And here are some more interesting pictures. Reeves laid out a new series of photos. Here Sterling is with Margaret Fisher, the owner of a chain of beauty salons. She transferred him $80,000, and here with Elizabeth Donovan, a realtor. $45,000 came in from her. Every picture was a hit. Sterling looked sincere and in love in all of them. We found a very interesting diary at his house. Pierce opened a file folder. He kept detailed notes about each woman. Your file is particularly interesting. Single, successful, needs acceptance. Easily manipulated through displays of care and attention. Juliet felt tears running down her cheeks. Why are you showing me all this? Because you had a motive, Reeves said stiffly. You found out about his schemes, and you wanted revenge. What? No, I didn't know anything. Do you have an alibi for the night of the murder? I told you, I was at home. Alone. No witnesses. Pierce shook her head. And your car was parked in a parking lot where the cameras hadn't been working for a week because of a technical glitch. At that moment, a young officer entered the room. Detective Reeves, Miss Winters is here, ready to testify. Wait here. Reeves stood up. We're not done yet. Juliet was alone. The clock on the wall showed the beginning of 11 o'clock at night. She remembered that she hadn't warned Martha about canceling tomorrow's appointments. Such a mundane thought seemed absurd to her at such a moment. Through the thin wall, she could hear muffled voices from the next room. Acacia spoke confusedly, sobbing often. He came into my life a year ago. I thought it was love. He said he wanted to open his own gym, that he needed money for a down payment. I believed him. I gave all my savings. Her voice grew louder and louder. And then there she was, rich, beautiful. He said it was just for the money, that we'd be together as soon as he raised the right amount. I believed it. Juliet closed her eyes. All the moments of their short-lived romance flashed before her mind. His attentive gaze, warm hands guiding her during training, talking about the future, kissing furtively in an empty gym. It was all a lie. I was going to tell her the truth. Acacia's voice became clearer. I made an appointment to meet her at the cafe, but I couldn't. I was scared. And then I found out that She burst into tears. The door opened and Cordelia Pierce came in with a new file. We have some new information. Where do you keep your jewelry collection, Mrs. Van Holden? In the safe at home and in a safety deposit box. Why? We found photos of your jewelry and a detailed plan of your security system in Sterling's apartment. Looks like you weren't just another victim of his romantic con. He was up to something more serious. Juliet felt very dizzy. The last thing she heard before she passed out was Pierce's voice calling for paramedics. After that night at the police station, a week passed. Juliet hardly showed up at the office, having handed over most of the day-to-day business to Martha. She had been released on her own recognizance, and now every day began with a call to the officer on duty. That morning, she sat in her living room, looking through old messages from Sterling. Every word read differently now. Every phrase seemed part of a well-thought-out plan. One message from a month ago caught her attention. Met an old friend from Vermont. Reminded me of home. Vermont. He'd said he'd grown up there. Juliet opened her laptop and started searching. An hour later, she was on the phone with the editor of the local newspaper in the small town of Bennington. "Sterling Walsh?" the elderly reporter interjected. "Of course I remember the story. It was a high-profile scandal 5 years ago. He worked at a private school as a physical education teacher until the story of the missing money from the school sports club fund came to light, about $100,000. The case was hushed up. The parents didn't want publicity, but he was fired." Juliet wrote down every word. "And his family?" "As I recall, he was raised in foster care. No one knew his real parents. New lead." She called her lawyer, and within 2 hours, she had information from Vermont Social Services. Sterling had been in 3 foster homes. In the last one, with the Morrisons, he'd lived the longest, from age 12 to 18. Morrison, like Ted Morrison. Juliet straightened sharply in her chair. Ted wasn't just a co-worker. He was Sterling's foster brother. The doorbell rang. Cordelia Pierce stood on the threshold. "May I come in? I have some new information." They settled in the living room. Pierce pulled out a file folder. "We checked Sterling's financial history. In addition to the money he received from the women, he had large debts, very large debts. He owed almost $300,000 to bookmakers. Gambling? Yeah, but not just gambling. We found bills from clinics. He was being treated for drug addiction, expensive private centers, deluxe rooms. The money was going out the window." Juliet remembered how Sterling sometimes seemed strangely agitated at practice, his hands shaking a little. "What about Ted Morrison?" she asked. "Did you know they were foster brothers?" Pierce raised her eyebrows in surprise. "We were just about to talk to you about that. How did you find out?" "I started my own investigation." "I see. Yes, we found out the connection. And something else interesting. Ted was making money transfers to Sterling too, large sums once a month. Why? Sounds like blackmail." "We found an encrypted folder of photos on Sterling's phone. There's Ted and Acacia in some pretty compromising situations." Juliet remembered the tense looks between Ted and Acacia. Were they dating too? In fact, they were engaged. Before Sterling came along. A picture was beginning to emerge. Sterling ruined his foster brother's relationship, had an affair with his fiancée, and then used it to blackmail him. "We've established something else," Pierce continued. "There were hidden cameras in the gym, not the security ones. Additional ones installed in the locker rooms, the coach's room, even the principal's office. Why? Blackmail material. We found tapes of the gym's management talking about tax evasion, intimate staff meetings, confidential conversations with clients. Sterling was collecting dirt on everyone." Juliet stood up and walked to the window. Downstairs, ordinary life was bustling with people going about their business, unaware of the dramas playing out above their heads. "I want to see his apartment," she said suddenly. "That's impossible. It's a crime scene." "Look, I was his victim too. Maybe I'll see something your experts missed. Something personal." Pierce hesitated. "It's against the rules. Please, I need to understand." After a long pause, the detective nodded. "All right, but only in my presence." Sterling's apartment was nothing like Juliet had imagined. No sports equipment, minimal furniture. But there were electronics everywhere. Computers, monitors, some kind of recording equipment. "This is where he edited the footage from the cameras," Pierce explained. A corkboard hung on the bedroom wall, piled with photos and notes. Juliet saw herself, a few pictures taken in secret. They showed her leaving the office, getting into her car, eating lunch at a restaurant. Nearby were notes of her schedule, her habits, her alarm codes. "He was planning a robbery," Pierce said. "Your house, your boutiques, he had diagrams of every room. In a desk drawer, they found fake passports in different names and a wad of cash in different currencies. He was getting ready to make a run for it." Juliet opened the closet and froze. On the top shelf was a familiar gym bag. "What is it?" Pierce asked. "That bag. He had it with him that last night at the restaurant. He kept it with him all the time, even went to the bathroom with it. I made a joke about it." Pierce quickly put on her gloves and pulled out the bag. Inside were documents, some contracts, photos, flash drives. "It looks like all of his victims' files are in here," the detective muttered, looking through the papers. "And what's this?" She pulled out an envelope full of photos. They were of Ted in different places at different times. It looked like he'd been followed. Look at the dates. Juliet pointed to the numbers on the back of the photos. The last photo was taken the day before Sterling disappeared. I need to get in touch with Reeves right away. And you'd better get home. Already in the cab, Juliet received a message from an unknown number. I know the truth about that night. Meet me tomorrow at 10 a.m. at the cafe by the gym. Acacia. All night, Juliet couldn't sleep. She sat in the kitchen, staring at the twinkling lights of the city outside the window and twirling a cup of long-cooled tea in her hands. The message from Acacia kept her awake. She tried to call Detective Pierce, but the phone was unavailable. The morning was overcast. A rare phenomenon for Miami. Heavy gray clouds covered the sky, giving the city an unusually gloomy look. Juliet arrived at the cafe 20 minutes ahead of schedule. Through the large windows, she could see Acacia already sitting at the far table, nervously thumbing through sugar packets. "Thank you for coming," Acacia said quietly as Juliet lowered herself across from her. There were dark circles under the girl's eyes, and the fingers holding the cup of coffee were visibly trembling. "You said you knew the truth." Acacia looked around and pulled a tattered diary out of her bag. "This is Sterling's diary, not the one the police found, the real one. Where did you get it?" "I took it from the coach room the day when he was found. I knew where he was hiding it." Juliet gingerly picked up the day planner. The pages were scribbled in small, nervous handwriting. "I have to start from the beginning." Acacia took a deep breath. "I met Ted 2 years ago when I came to work at Elite Fitness. He was kind, reliable, caring. 6 months later, we started dating. Another 3 months later, he proposed." She fell silent, staring out the window at the passing cars. "And then Sterling showed up?" "Yes. He came to the gym 8 months ago. Ted was so happy to see him, a foster brother after all. They hadn't seen each other in years. Sterling said he wanted to start a new life, that he'd given up drugs." That's when Juliet's phone rang. It was Cordelia Pierce. "We found new evidence. We found traces of Sterling's blood in the trunk of Ted's car. And the gas station cameras caught his car the night of the murder near your office." "I'm with Acacia now," Juliet said quietly. "She has Sterling's diary. Don't move from where you are. We're on our way." Acacia continued talking without noticing the conversation. At first, everything was fine. Ted helped his brother with money, got him a job, and then... She clenched her fists. "Then Sterling started courting me. Secret notes, casual touches, long conversations after work. And you fell in love." "Yes," her voice trembled. "He was so different, dangerous, the complete opposite of Ted. We started seeing each other in secret. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't stop. Did Ted know?" "He knew. I could see the pain in his eyes. But he didn't say anything, just started drinking. And then Sterling started blackmailing him with our pictures, demanded money for his silence." Juliet opened the diary to the last pages. The entries became increasingly erratic. "Ted suspects something. We need to accelerate the plan. Van Holden is biting. Couple more weeks we can get the bank codes. Acacia's becoming a problem. She knows too much. Meeting with the bookie today. Need more time." The last entry was dated the day he disappeared. "Ted knows. He knows everything. Meet me at 11 o'clock. "What happened that night?" Juliet asked. I saw them." Acacia lowered her head. "They met in the parking lot of the gym. I followed Sterling. I wanted to talk to him. They were fighting. Sterling threatened to tell everyone that Ted had embezzled money from gym customers. He had proof." Detectives Pierce and Reeves entered the cafe. Acacia flinched, but continued talking, louder now. "Ted was drunk. He was screaming that Sterling had ruined his life, stolen his fiancée, blackmailed him. Sterling laughed, said that Ted was to blame. Weak, a loser. Even his own family had abandoned him." "What happened then?" Reeves asked, sitting down next to him. "Ted hit him. Sterling fell, hit his head on the curb. He didn't move. Ted panicked, dragged the body into his car. I hid behind a pillar so he couldn't see me." "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Pierce asked. "I loved them both," Acacia said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "And I betrayed them both. At that moment, Juliet's cell phone rang. She pulled it out of her bag and froze. Sterling's name popped up on the screen. It was the old phone that the police had returned to her yesterday, having taken down all the necessary data. "What's wrong?" Pierce noticed her reaction. There's a voicemail from Sterling. It was in the drafts folder. He must have written it down but didn't have time to send it." With trembling fingers, she turned it on. Sterling's voice, a little drunk, filled the silence. "Juliet, I have to tell you everything. I'm a broken man, I know. I've used everyone. You, Acacia, other women. But with you, it's different. I'm really starting to feel. It doesn't matter. Ted found out about all my affairs, the robbery I was planning. He wants me to return the money and disappear. Threatens to turn me into the police. I'm going to meet him if anything happens to me." The tape cut off. Pierce was already on the phone. Ted's car was spotted on Highway 95, heading toward Georgia. Send all available patrols. Acacia suddenly turned pale. "Oh my God." In the trunk of his car, there's Sterling's bag of evidence. Ted took it that night. He said he got rid of it, but I saw that bag in his garage yesterday. We need to stop him before he destroys the evidence. Sterling's phone vibrated in her hand, a message from an unfamiliar number. "I have what the police are looking for. Meet me in an hour at the pier. Come alone. Ted." Juliet stared at the message from Tad until the phone screen went blank. Detectives Reeves and Pierce were organizing a chase. Acacia was giving a formal statement to the arriving police officers. No one noticed as she quietly walked out of the cafe. The sky over Miami darkened, portending a severe storm. The wet wind off the bay fluttered her hair as she walked toward the old pier. She was familiar with this place. She often walked here in the evenings, trying to sort out her feelings for Sterling. Ted was already waiting for her. He was sitting on the edge of the dock with his legs over the water. Next to him was a tattered gym bag, the same one she'd seen Sterling carrying the last night. "I knew you'd come alone," he said without turning around. "You're just like him. Can't resist secrets. Why didn't you leave? What would be the point?" He grinned bitterly. "They'll find you anyway. I'm not cut out for a life on the run." Sterling was the master of disappearing. Juliet approached him cautiously. "Tell me what happened that night." Ted finally turned to her. His face was pale, his eyes red. "I really loved him. He was my little brother. When they brought him to us, he was so lost, so scared. I swore to myself that I would always protect him. The first drops of rain fell on the planks of the dock. What went wrong? Everything. He started stealing in high school, first little things. Pocket money, watches, cell phones. I covered for him, thought he'd grow out of it. Then it was drugs. I paid for his treatment over and over again. When he showed up here, swore he'd changed." Ted pulled a crumpled photograph out of his pocket, a picture of him and Sterling, very young, smiling for the camera against a Christmas tree. "And then he'd fallen in love with Acacia?" "No," Ted shook his head. "He never loved anyone. It was a game. He found out I was taking a percentage of my clients' payments. Nothing serious, but enough to lose my license. He started blackmailing me. And then, he started dating Acacia to hurt you." "Yeah, with you too. That was his big plan. Rob your boutiques, take everything of value from the safes. He had codes, floor plans. The rain's getting heavier." "I didn't mean to kill him." Ted's voice trembled. "He was drunk that night, bragging about how he'd tricked everyone. Said Acacia was always in love with him, just agreed to go out with me out of pity. I hit him. He fell. I panicked and planted the body in my car to frame me. I'm sorry. I didn't know what to do. His bag had all the evidence against me and against him. I wanted to get rid of it all, start over. Police sirens sounded in the distance. "They're on their way," Juliet said quietly. "You need to turn yourself in." "I know," Ted stood up. "You know what he said before he died?" "I finally felt something real. He was talking about you. When the police arrived, they were both soaked to the skin. Ted didn't resist arrest. They found all the documents in the bag, proof of Sterling's fraud, robbery plans, photos of his victims, and a thumb drive with footage from those hidden cameras at the gym. The next weeks were a blur of interrogations, depositions, paperwork. Ted confessed to everything and got 7 years for manslaughter." Acacia quit Elite Fitness and left town. The story hit the papers, and Juliet had to temporarily close her boutiques until the scandal subsided. A month later, she was sitting in her office, sorting through old things. On the table was a photograph taken at their last dinner with Sterling, both of them smiling, and she noticed for the first time how empty his smile had been. The next morning, she woke up without a heavy weight on her heart for the first time in a long time. She put on a new tracksuit and drove to a newly opened fitness center on the other side of town. People were working out in the spacious bright hall, calm music was playing, and coffee from a small cafe in the lobby smelled. "Good morning," the girl at the front desk smiled. "What can I do for you?" "I'd like to sign up for a group class. I think it's time for me to learn how to exercise with company." As she was filling out the form, she heard laughter from the gym, the normal, genuine laughter of people just enjoying life. Juliet caught her reflection in the mirror. The wrinkles around her eyes had become more noticeable. There was more gray in her hair, but her gaze was clear and calm. In the evening, she sat on the balcony of her apartment, sipping green tea and looking out at the lights of the city. Her phone rang. Marta announced that the suppliers from Milan were ready to renew their cooperation. On the coffee table lay the glossy brochure of the new gym. On its pages smiled ordinary people, not perfect, not retouched, just happy.